2 months ago, when we first talked about XREAL Aura, there were two very different reactions. On one side, people were genuinely excited about what XREAL was building: lightweight spatial computing glasses, Android XR Gemini, a massive 70-degree field of view, and enough processing power to potentially do much more than simply mirror your phone or laptop. But on the other side, almost everyone had the same concern: the price. Some of you said $800 would make sense, others said maybe $1,000. But once that number started approaching the $1,500 ceiling XREAL had announced, a lot of people said they would simply wait. Well, here's the interesting part. Apparently, plenty of people didn't wait. XREAL has now announced that Aura has passed 10,000 reservations globally, despite the fact that we still don't know exactly how much the final product is going to cost. And I think that's actually a much bigger deal than the number itself. Because remember, Aura isn't a $200 pair of smart glasses. XREAL has only promised that the base configuration won't exceed $1,500 before tax. Yet more than 10,000 people have already been willing to put money down just to secure their place in line. Even the original Founder Priority Pass is gone. XREAL offered 2,000 of those at $299, and they sold out within just 36 hours. The original $99 launch credit promotion has also reached its allocation, and XREAL is now offering a refundable priority reservation for people who still want to get in line. Now, we should make an important distinction here. 10,000 reservations do not necessarily mean 10,000 final sales. These deposits are refundable before the final purchase is confirmed. So once XREAL reveals the actual price, there will almost certainly be people who change their minds. But even with that qualification, getting more than 10,000 people interested enough to reserve an unreleased XR product is impressive, particularly considering how uncertain this category still is. And I think we're starting to understand why Aura is getting this much attention. Because the more you look at it, the less it resembles the XREAL glasses we've been familiar with over the last few years. This isn't simply a wearable monitor. XREAL is calling Aura a spatial computer, and there's actually some substance behind that description. The glasses themselves weigh less than 95 grams, which is probably one of the most important numbers on the entire specification sheet. Compare that with traditional mixed reality headsets and you immediately understand what XREAL is trying to accomplish. Instead of putting the processor, large battery, and everything else directly on your head, XREAL moves most of that hardware into a separate compute puck. Yes, that means there's a cable, and I know some people are going to hate that. In fact, on our previous video, several of you said you'd rather connect the glasses directly to your smartphone than carry another computing device. I completely understand that argument. But there is another side to it. That external puck is one of the reasons XREAL can keep the actual glasses below 95 grams while still delivering considerably more processing power than conventional display glasses. Inside the puck is Qualcomm's Snapdragon Reality Elite platform, while XREAL's own X1S spatial coprocessor handles spatial processing on the glasses. So instead of trying to squeeze an entire XR computer onto your face, XREAL has essentially divided the system into two pieces: performance in your pocket, displays, cameras, and sensors on your face. And Aura's display system is probably the other reason enthusiasts are paying attention. We're looking at a 70-degree field of view. That is a significant step up from the relatively narrow virtual displays that have traditionally defined this category. Aura uses optical see-through technology as well, which means you're actually looking through the lenses at the real world while digital content is projected into your vision. That's fundamentally different from a VR or mixed reality headset where cameras capture the outside world and then reproduce it on internal displays. Here, you're still looking directly at reality. And that's important because it makes Aura much closer to what people imagine when they hear the term augmented reality glasses. The glasses also have spatial tracking and hand tracking, meaning digital windows can actually exist within your physical environment rather than simply following your head around like a floating television. And then we get to what could ultimately determine whether Aura becomes useful or just another impressive XR demo: Android XR. This is where I think Aura becomes considerably more interesting than XREAL's previous products. Instead of XREAL having to create an entire software ecosystem by itself, Aura is being built around Google's Android XR platform. That potentially gives it access to Android applications, Google's services, and most importantly, developers who are already familiar with the Android ecosystem. XREAL and Google are also actively encouraging developers to build experiences specifically for Aura. And that part shouldn't be underestimated. Because we've seen impressive XR hardware before. The problem is that once you've watched movies on a giant virtual screen and played around with a few spatial demos, you start asking, what do I actually do with this every day? That's the question Android XR needs to answer. If I can open Chrome, YouTube, Maps, productivity apps, and multiple Android applications around me, if I can connect a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse, if I can connect the system to a laptop or gaming handheld and use Aura as a huge portable display, then suddenly this becomes much easier to understand as a product. And then there's Gemini. Google isn't treating AI as a separate application inside Android XR. The idea is that Gemini can become part of the interface itself. With the appropriate permissions, it can understand visual context and potentially help based on what you're actually looking at. And this is where things start getting genuinely futuristic. Imagine looking at an object and simply asking what it is. Looking at something written in another language and asking for a translation. Looking at a piece of equipment and asking how to use it. Or having information appear in your field of view without constantly pulling a phone out of your pocket. That's the long-term promise. Whether Aura actually delivers that experience smoothly is something we'll only know once the finished hardware and software are in people's hands. And that's also why I don't think the 10,000 reservation number means XREAL has already won. If anything, it means XREAL has successfully completed the first part of the challenge. It got people's attention. The next part is much harder. It has to justify the price. And I still think that's going to be Aura's biggest challenge. In our previous video, one viewer made a really interesting comparison. They said $1,500 is the price of a decent laptop, and that's exactly the problem Aura faces. At $500, you're comparing this against other smart glasses. At $800, maybe you're comparing it against premium XR accessories. But once you start moving toward $1,500, consumers begin comparing it against flagship phones, gaming laptops, premium tablets, and full mixed reality headsets. At that point, Aura can't just be a really impressive pair of glasses. It needs to become something people actually use every day. And that's why I think the final price announcement may be even more important than everything XREAL has announced so far. If XREAL surprises everyone and comes in significantly below that $1,500 ceiling, I think Aura becomes much easier to recommend. If it's $999, for example, the conversation changes immediately. But if the base model lands close to $1,500, XREAL is going to have to demonstrate that this is genuinely a spatial computer and not just a premium wearable display. There is another interesting detail here though. Those first 10,000 reservations suggest that there is at least a group of consumers willing to pay serious money for this form factor. And that tells us something about the XR market in general. For years, companies have been trying to answer the question, what comes after smartphones? Maybe the answer isn't a giant headset. Maybe it isn't AI glasses without displays either. Maybe there's a middle ground. Something that still looks somewhat like glasses, gives you a genuine display, understands the environment around you, runs familiar applications, and moves the heavy computing hardware somewhere else. Aura isn't that perfect future yet. There's still a cable, there's still a puck, the glasses are still much larger than normal eyewear, and we still need to see how Android XR and Gemini perform outside controlled demonstrations. But this feels much closer to that future than most products we've seen so far. And that's why 10,000 reservations matter. Not because XREAL has already sold 10,000 finished products. It hasn't. But because 10,000 people were interested enough in this idea to put money down before XREAL would even tell them the final price. Now XREAL has to prove that their confidence was justified. Aura is still expected to arrive this fall. And I think there are now 3 things we really need to see. The final price, the final launch date, and most importantly, what Android XR actually feels like when you live with it every day. Because if XREAL gets those things right, Aura could become much more than another pair of AR glasses. But if it launches close to $1,500 without enough genuinely useful software, reservations could look very different once customers are asked to pay the remaining balance. So now that we've learned considerably more about Aura, I'm curious whether your opinion has changed. If XREAL launches this at $1,500, are you buying it? What about $1,200? Or is $999 still the magic number? Let me know down in the comments. And if you're one of those first 10,000 people who already reserved Aura, I especially want to hear from you. What convinced you to put money down before knowing the final price? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.